Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NFF's 14-part financial management webinar series. We're so happy that you've joined us for today's session, Telling Your Financial Story, which is the last webinar in the series, Using Data for Day-to-Day Management and Communicating with Stakeholders. Today's webinar will be presented by Beth Dorian, a manager in our advisory services practice from our Philadelphia office. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Dominique, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone is muted to ensure high sound quality. Though everyone is on mute, we would still love to answer your questions. You can send in your questions at any time by typing them into the chat box located near the bottom of your GoToWebinar panel. I'll be able to respond to you via chat right away, and then I'll relay your questions to Beth during the question answer portion of today's webinar. Within 24 hours following the conclusion of the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recorded session, the PowerPoint slides, and a worksheet to help you apply the concepts we'll review today. It'll come from an NFF.org email address, so be sure to check your spam if it does not arrive. If you would like to access the presentation slides right now, you may do so by downloading them from the handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. Please note you may have to click a small plus box with an arrow to expand the handout section and access the slides. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Beth to begin.
Great, thank you, Dom. So as Dom introduced, today's webinar topic is telling your financial story. So by nature, people love stories. I know for myself, you can see my love of storytelling very clearly if you look at a list of the podcasts I listen to on my daily commute, things like The Moth or StoryCorps or This American Life. And many nonprofit leaders believe in the power of storytelling and use it well for things like explaining their purpose and their mission. For example, telling a client story of their journey, why they came to your organization, how your organization helped them. This is often a popular way to personalize your mission and help answer the questions of why do you exist and what do you do? So in today's webinar, I'll argue that storytelling can be equally compelling in finance. When you can tell your financial story, you can build trust and credibility, you can inspire and energize stakeholders around strategy, and you can advocate for the resources that you need to fulfill your mission. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund, or NFF as we call ourselves. So NFF is a national nonprofit serving the nonprofit sector from 5 offices across the country. We've been around for over 35 years, providing loans and investments into nonprofits and social enterprises, providing advice on financial management challenges so that we can build the capacity of nonprofit leaders and organizations, and finally, lifting up what we're learning on the ground to share with others across the sector through advocacy. In this webinar series, we share what we've learned from our work across the entire sector with nonprofits of all kinds. So we have 3 goals for today. First, to understand how different audiences in different contexts require different stories. Second, to learn 3 financial stories that every leader should know how to tell. And third, to equip yourself with prompting questions and examples to write your own narrative. So in advising clients on writing their stories, we've learned that there is no one template an organization can use to tell their story, but they greatly benefit by understanding what questions they should be able to answer and what resources they have to do so. And they also benefit by seeing examples. So throughout this webinar, we'll give you multiple examples of narratives. We'll conclude with a case study. And following the webinar, we'll send you some guides to help you write your own narrative. So to begin, what is a financial story? What are we talking about? So we've heard time and time again how stories can help the listener engage with your mission and your work. So to complement that mission story, there is also a financial story, and that's the subject of today's webinar. So to define what we mean, a financial story is a communication tool that allows you to talk to different stakeholders about your organization's financial situation. It typically comes in the form of written narrative, and it explains where you are today financially, how you got there, and your strategies for going forward. And it does all this with a grounding in numbers. The narrative alone and the numbers alone can't tell the whole story. But when combined, the numbers can lend credibility to the narrative by quantifying trends and the effects of your financial decisions. When stakeholders understand your financial story, they can make better decisions to support your organization. Telling your story prevents misinterpretation of your financial information, and it allows you to be a better advocate for your organization and its needs. You're asked for these stories in many contexts, and we'll explore some specific contexts later in this webinar. And we'll also encourage you to write a comprehensive narrative that can help you in many ways. One of them being going through the exercise of telling your story to yourself gives you clarity and confidence when speaking about your organization's management and its needs. So in addition to telling your story to yourself, let's talk about who else needs to hear your story and why. So while the basic components of your financial story may not change, the focus of the narrative will be tailored depending on the purpose and perspective of your audience. So let's first consider why financial stories are powerful for internal audiences, such as boards and staff. So first, it focuses board and staff on information that's important for decision-making and adjusting behavior. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a finance committee spend 10 minutes discussing a line item that's less than 1% of their total budget. A waste of time. So financial documents should highlight the financial items and trends that are worth talking about. For example, at-risk revenue, or large expense items that are under management control, or variances to the budget that require action. Next, a financial story can ground your strategic priorities in numbers. I've seen some very thoughtful, beautiful strategic plans that don't fully contemplate its financial implications. Strategy can become more real and tangible for board and staff when you understand things like revenue generation or a change in expense structure. With a good financial narrative and depending on your function, you can understand your role in making these changes happen. Further, when there is any kind of organizational change, understanding its financial implications can inspire buy-in. A better understanding of the reasoning behind the change can motivate the required behavioral change. For example, I worked with a client whose employees would submit expense reports 6 months late. At the end of the year, management was scrambling to find cash to pay their employees and realizing that they had overspent their budget. So we worked with them towards a more inclusive budget process where staff better understood their program budgets and how these budgets fit into the bigger picture of the organization's financial health. Further, we explained the reasoning behind a new expense reimbursement policy. The staff understood that timely expense reports enables the organization to better track their budget performance and ensure access to cash so that they can actually pay their expenses. And finally, internal storytelling can increase staff confidence in management. For me, there is nothing that makes me breathe more easily than when our CFO presents our annual budget. And in that presentation, he describes any risk in the upcoming year and steps our organization has taken to mitigate these risks. I know that he's considered many scenarios for the coming year, and he has a plan to ensure that we remain a financially healthy organization. So now for external audiences, like a donor or a lender or a project partner. Here, stories can help you advocate for your need and avoid any misinterpretation. So when rejected for a grant, I've heard a lot of feedback from clients that the funder said something like, we don't think you need the money because you charge client fees, or you have too much cash, or your net assets are too large. All of these things are financial indicators that tell only one small piece of the story. So maybe the client fees only cover 50% of the cost to deliver services. Or maybe cash is high at year end on the financial statements that you gave to that funder, but your cash flow projection shows low points halfway throughout the year. Maybe net assets are high, but they're restricted for certain purposes. Or maybe when you look deeper into those red assets or the cash and you compare it with expenses, you realize that they cover less than a month of expenses. So you actually have rather low liquidity. Because external audiences have limited knowledge of your organization's operations, these are important dynamics to address upfront. Otherwise, you're more exposed to misinterpretation. The same is true when reporting to funders. Most grants come with some kind of reporting requirement to explain how funds were used and how the organization performed as a whole. A firm grasp of your organization's performance can help you tell that story well. And finally, one of the key things that NFF has observed in the field and advocates for across the sector is honest, transparent communication. It's one of the key factors in having the funder relationship be one that is truly a partnership. When a nonprofit can be honest and clear about its needs, a funder should respond more effectively. So with that, I'd like to have our first poll. And the question is, how well does your staff know your financial situation? And I'm going to describe a few options and then have you choose. So the first is really well. So they give budget input, they review interim reports and adjust behavior accordingly. They understand the financial statements. The second option is they know a little bit. So let's say they see a program budget, but they don't understand maybe how it fits into the bigger financial picture. The third option is not at all. We never share budgets or reports. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Dom.
Thanks, Beth. I'm launching the poll now. You should see it on your screen in a few seconds. Okay, great. So the poll's up. Feel free to put your responses in. We'll give folks a few seconds to get their responses in. All right, we're nearing critical mass, so I will keep it open for a few more seconds. Those last votes in. All right, so I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. All right, so for the question, for the poll, we have 21% of attendees saying really well, 74% saying they know a little bit, and then that 5%, the remaining 5% saying not at all. So the critical, most people are in this they know a little bit range.
Great, thanks, Dom. Okay, all right, so it sounds like a little bit, but not the big picture. So I'm glad you're here today, because hopefully we'll motivate you to make a little more visibility into the financial picture for your staff. So I would ask those of you who responded a little bit or not at all to consider if there's any kind of staff behavior that you might want to change, or any aspect of organization culture that you may want to develop that relates to finance. Think back to my expense report example. So consider how sharing timely and relevant financial information with staff might support that. And if you're starting these discussions from scratch, here's one idea. So a client recently shared with me that at a staff meeting, she told the staff, hey, we're working with this group, Nonprofit Finance Fund, and they're helping us improve our financial decision-making and improve our communications. Take a Post-it and write any question that you have about the organization's finances. So she collected all these responses, and it was a really eye-opening exercise for her. And it helped the executive director focus her internal communications on what the staff really wanted to know. So just an idea. So another reason why it's important to engage all stakeholders in financial storytelling is because everyone has different perspectives and can offer different helpful input. Especially when faced with a lot of questions about the future, it's important to recognize that no one person has the answer to what's going on. So this picture that you're seeing portrays this classic fable of the blind man touching parts of an elephant, and each having his own interpretation of what he's touching based on the part that he feels. So like this picture reflects, each of us has a piece of information, like the trunk or the tail or the ear, but we need others and their different perspectives to construct a better view. That means when faced with a challenge, it's even more important to open a dialogue with your staff, your board, your funders, and other stakeholders. So as an example, let's say you just got word that a funder who comprises 20% of your annual budget will end their support in 2 years. So here, in this situation, an early dialogue about it, starting with staff, could, 1, clarify the effect on your finances, 2, acknowledge any anxiety folks might be feeling about this, 3, it could present some ways that the organization could respond. So, for example, find funding to replace it, or cut expenses, or change the way that you do your work. 4, identify the likelihood of success for these responses and consider any implications for mission or culture or how you operate. And then 5, just open it up to other ideas. What haven't we considered? And then finally, give clarity around the decision-making process. Through this inclusive dialogue, it helps everyone get on the same page. It builds that buy-in, which will be hugely important if this organization needs to make changes down the road. And for the board, you would go through a similar process, clarifying the situation, presenting options, soliciting their help, and ensuring that whatever decision that you do make will be a success. And then in this example of losing funding, this is a great opportunity to share early on with other funders that you're looking for replacement revenue. And if they can't increase their support, could they maybe support in another way by introducing you to other potential funders or giving a capacity grant that might help you start building a different kind of revenue? So, for example, a development person that focuses on individual donors, something like that. So that's an example of a known situation and how proactive dialogue can help. But we've also used this elephant table to talk more generally about how to navigate during times of great uncertainty. And certainly this past year, we've talked a lot about how when there's a dramatic political shift that's affecting many organizations, dialogue is vital for organizations who know that there's the potential for a dramatic shift in their funding or demand for their services. In this case, funders really appreciate knowing your concerns because they're in the same boat as you. They don't know what's going to change. It's helpful for them to understand what's going on in your organization. So when it comes time for them to make a decision, they're informed on the landscape of who they care about. Same with your networks, your partners, your advocacy groups, anyone connected to your mission area. They'll help you know what advocacy is happening in your field. They'll help you know how others are responding. And those partnerships may become even more important moving ahead. So it's helpful to strengthen your allies and your relationships. So maybe they feel a part of that elephant that you don't, and they can offer helpful information to make that uncertainty a little less so. So to wrap up this idea of communicating early and soliciting input, I'll just note that when staff are involved, they tend to develop a shared sense of responsibility for the organization's well-being and plans. It's easier for staff to buy into hard decisions if they feel they understand the context for them. They also may have some of the best ideas, especially for things like how to generate new revenue or how to manage your expenses, because they're the ones who are closest to your programs. Second, your board is fiscally responsible for your organization, so they need to be informed. Ultimately, they must buy into and advocate for whatever kind of strategy you're trying to implement. And this becomes possible when board members have a shared understanding of the organization's financial situation and risk tolerance, in addition to your mission and your strategic priorities. And then finally, while every funder is different, most will appreciate honesty and having information sooner rather than later. Funders want to see organizations are proactively making plans to adjust their budgets and operations based on the external and internal triggers they're facing. You also owe it to yourselves, as well as funders, to communicate your true financial needs for sustaining your enterprise. So now let's talk about some common places we're asked to tell financial stories and the guiding questions that we should use to tell them. So first we'll discuss items related to planning and management. Some of these things don't necessarily require written narratives, but we'll argue as we go through this that written narratives can be very effective in highlighting what's important in these reports. So we'll talk about strategic plans, annual budgets, and interim financial statements. Then we'll talk about external communications, things like grant proposals and reports, and audited financial statements. So these things, by nature, do involve some kind of requirement for a written narrative. Just by its nature, an audit is a written narrative, along with the numbers. And we're going to take each one of these one by one. So let's start with the strategic plan. So as I mentioned earlier, I've seen a lot of thoughtful strategic plans that don't fully flesh out its financial implications. And what I want to encourage you to consider today is that at a minimum, there are some storytelling elements that should be included in any kind of strategic plan. So a strategic plan typically looks over a longer period of time than 1 year. And so that is a great opportunity to contemplate the financial implications of the changes that you are making. And so here we ask ourselves, what do we think our finances will look like over a multi-year time frame? And how will that change over time based on the strategies that we're implementing? So how will these strategies affect revenue? How will they affect expenses? How will they affect our capital structure? Does our strategy require any kind of one-time cost? Pulling out one-time cost in any kind of change movement can be very effective because it makes the business model, simply the revenue and expenses, more clear when any special one-time things are pulled out. And we often see that in a strategic plan where you need specific resources and have specific expenses related to doing something differently. And then finally, how can our capital structure support risk mitigation? So for example, if our strategic plan involves growth, do we have an operating reserve that is scaling with that growth? Or if we're taking on some risk in trying new things, do we have resources to support that? For example, something like an opportunity or risk fund. So now let's talk about your annual budget. So this one, I'm guessing everyone on the webinar has been involved with or has reviewed for your organization at some point. And for those of you who attended webinar 4 or 5, you went into this topic in detail. But today we'll just talk a little more broadly. So again, this is one where you're not required to write a narrative. Sometimes when funders ask for your annual budget, they'll ask for a budget narrative. But in general, it's about how you present it to your board, to your staff, and to other stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, a narrative can be so helpful because it ensures that you're focusing on the things that matter. So a written narrative that goes hand in hand with that budget, or even comments specifically line by line throughout the budget, so it's right there next to it, can be very helpful, especially when those comments are highlighting the most important things. So for example, variances from prior years or big ticket items. So some of the key questions that a financial narrative should answer with your annual budget include the first basic question of how will we make and spend money in support of our mission over the next 12 months, if that's your budgeting period. So what are our revenue? What are our expenses? Second, in thinking about our expenses, have we considered the full cost of our operations that go beyond the day-to-day operating expenses? So are we generating surpluses that are large enough to support things like debt payments if we have debt, or additions to fixed assets that don't show up on our income statement but are part of our balance sheet, or increasing any kind of reserves or increasing our working capital position? Does our budget include that? And again, if you went through the strategic budgeting webinar, we went through that idea in detail, and I would encourage you to look back at that if you did for some more thoughts on how you might portray that in a budget. Next, how do revenue and expense compare to the prior years, both in magnitude, so the size, as well as the distribution? So are there any significant shifts? And if there are, highlight those variances and explain why. Is any of our budgeted revenue at risk? So have we contemplated multiple revenue scenarios, and how are we mitigating this? And then finally, how will we manage our expenses to align with revenue if that revenue picture does not come out the way we expected it to? What's within our control? What are changes that we can make throughout the year that will give you some confidence in approving this budget? So next we want to talk about interim financial statements. So these would be things like your budgeted versus actual expenses, a balance sheet, updated cash flow projections. So like our budget, we could definitely see a written narrative as a cover letter or side-by-side to give clarity to the report and to highlight the most important lines that your stakeholders should be discussing with you. So first, how does our performance compare with our budget? So again, highlighting those variances. Does any of these variances require action? So for example, if the revenue picture is different than you expected, might you need to cut expenses, or might you, in a good scenario, increase expenses? How has performance affected our balance sheet, our cash flow? And what actions should we take to manage cash flow? So for example, do we need to draw on or repay a line of credit or our reserves? Or would we need to extend payables if we find ourselves in a challenging cash position? Next, we want to consider these external looking reports or documents that often require some financial storytelling. So we'll start with the grant application or the grant report. So as I said before, some grant applications ask you for a budget narrative. So if you have that already in hand, it's a great way to respond to that request. But we also encourage organizations to go this extra step at being proactive in the way that you articulate your financial story, and then how the grant request fits into that trajectory. It makes it that much more compelling. So in addition to describing the budget and how the grant would fit into that, sometimes you're asked to characterize your financial health and how it's changed over time. So this is the opportunity to bring together the past, the present, and the future and talk about your overall trajectory of financial health. Second, sometimes in answering questions about management, you're asked questions about how you manage your finances. So asking questions about leadership and staff capacity. So who's on your finance team? How are things reviewed? What are your policies and procedures? Knowing these stories in advance can help anticipate any of these types of questions. And then what we're really trying to get to is, why do you need these funds? How will you use these funds? So again, making a clear link between your financial trajectory, your budget, and how the funder will fit into that is a key part of storytelling. And then finally, in grant reports, you're often asked to tell the story about how you spent the funds and if there were any variances. And finally, we want to talk about the annual audit. So if you attended webinar 2 on reading financial statements, you would have learned how to analyze an audit and how to think about trends. But today we'll talk more broadly about how the audit is a storytelling tool. And because the audit is often seen by external audiences like funders, we want our audit to tell the clearest and the best story it can. And this one is a real sore spot for many of my clients. I've heard clients say things like, we never look at our audit. We don't understand it. We don't understand how it's presented. It doesn't look like our books. And every year we just file it away and we never look at it again. And I hate to admit it, but in prior roles as a CFO with other organizations before my consulting life, I never saw my audit as a communication tool. I really thought of it as simply a compliance document and a compliance process that I had to go through every year. But we should recognize that the audit has a wealth of information. Not only does it give a year-over-year comparison, but it includes notes that describe a lot of the nuance behind your financial situation and how you should interpret what you're seeing in the numbers. And there's a lot to unpack in an audit, but here are some of the top questions that you should be able to answer with your audit. So first is the business model question. How do we make and spend money? This you can see on the statement of activities, or the income statement, or P&L, as we might more commonly call it. And how do we make and spend money in support of our mission? That we see in note 1. In the first note in the audit, you have your opportunity to tell the reader who you are, why you exist, and what impact you create. The next question you can answer in the audit, and the story you can tell, is how that statement of activities has changed over the past 2 years. Because an audit will typically have comparative year-over-year data. Next, you can tell the story of how your capital structure supports your work. So this is in the statement of position, or the balance sheet, as we more commonly call it. And likewise, we can answer how that's changed over the past 2 years. So what are some trends that we're seeing? We have the opportunity to talk about reserves. Do we have them? If so, for what purpose? Organizations often pull that out specifically in the numbers and then include notes that give more detail about that purpose. A next question that is new in a lot of our audits is the question of how do we think about liquidity? So you may be aware that FASB, which is the Standards Board for Nonprofits, have created some new standards that are going into place over the next 2 years. And one of those standards is including a note that talks specifically about your liquidity position. And as we struggle as nonprofits to figure out how to address this change, I think some of us will be tempted just to have our auditor write something that looks good and makes a little sense. But we really see this as an opportunity to show your financial prowess and to be really thoughtful about liquidity, which is a very important subject for nonprofits and one of the key financial measures that we talk about at NFF. So next in the audit, you talk about how you manage investment funds, if you have any. And then the audit can talk about restricted funds. What's included in there? Do you have any debt? And in your notes, there's the opportunity to provide more detail on that. And then finally, what is just other information that the reader should have to understand your financial situation? The notes is a great opportunity to include that kind of detail, that nuance that can help the reader understand the story. So we're going to do another poll, this time asking how comfortable do you feel talking about your audit? And I'll describe, again, 3 different responses. So the first is very comfortable. I refer to it often. We believe it tells a clear story, both in its format and with the accompanying notes. The second option is somewhat comfortable. I can explain it, but I don't really see it as a storytelling tool. Third option is not at all comfortable. So copies of my audit are sitting in a box in a dusty corner of my office. I never look at it. So Dom, take it away.
Perfect. You should see the poll coming up on your screen in just a moment. Great. So we'll collect responses for a few seconds. Okay, we're nearing 70%. If we can get a few more responses in, that'd be great. All right. So I'm going to close the poll and then share the responses. All right, so we have 21% of people saying they're very comfortable, 58% somewhat comfortable, and then 21% not comfortable at all.
Okay, thanks, Dom. So this one is not surprising to me at all. I definitely expected a bit more in the not at all comfortable than when we asked about staff and their comfort. Because again, it's something I've heard a lot from clients and it's something I've experienced myself. So I'll leave you with two pieces of advice. First is do everything you can via formatting of your numbers in the audit and your notes to tell a compelling story that you can understand. Also do everything you can to make it clearly link to how you think about and represent your numbers internally. Because that's one of the challenging things is sometimes clients will look at these two things as very different documents, very different presentation styles. But the more you can align how you communicate, for example, your top revenue categories or the way you look at expenses with your internal financial management, the easier it will be to make that connection and tell that story. But also recognize that no matter what, some will struggle to interpret an audit nonetheless. Some will look at all those pages of notes and say, this is too overwhelming. I don't understand this. And so one thing that can really help there is including a 1 to 2 page summary that just goes on top of your audit anytime you give it to someone. And this can highlight the story and make it more digestible using things like charts and graphs. And also acknowledge that an audit is really looking backwards. And sometimes because of the audit process, the thing might be 6 months old by the time you're handing it to someone, and the stories change. So to have a summary that you would give along with your audit can be very helpful in how it links the past to the future. So we just covered a number of different contexts and formats that you may be asked to tell a financial story. And so to prepare yourself to write these narratives in these common documents, we encourage clients to write a comprehensive narrative for themselves. So say 1 to 2 pages that tells the whole story from the past to the present to the future. And as I mentioned before, we also believe that telling this story to yourself can give you clarity and confidence. So we think it's really worth your time. It's also very helpful in training new staff and board. It gives them a big picture of where the organization has been and where it's going. To write this, we point clients to look at past financial statements, their audits, their current budgets, any strategic plans, and any multi-year projections. We also encourage clients to go through this exercise when you're creating your annual budget or perhaps the end of your fiscal year. And the questions that this big picture narrative should address are the following. So you start in the past. You talk about any key past trends that have led up to your present situation and highlight any large changes or contributing events and how they affected your financial situation. Then you move to the present. So where are you now? What's your current business model and how does that support mission? And then how have the responses to the past, how are they intended to affect your financial situation? And then moving forward, what's your strategy and vision for the future? What resources do you need for this strategy? And what are potential external or internal changes that might affect mission, approach, and business model? So what are these stories we're telling? So I've alluded to many of them in these prior slides as we've been thinking about different contexts and who we're talking to. But to bring it together, I want to talk about the 3 stories that you find yourself telling the most. The first is, what is your business model? Simply, how do you make and spend money in support of your mission? And when talking to certain audiences, how does that person fit into this business model? Second, what are some financial trends that we can observe? How are we responding to these trends? And what are we hoping will be the effect of those responses? And then finally, for any organization that's contemplating significant change or growth, this requires some special storytelling. One that revolves around how your business model will change as a result of this planned change, and what resources do we need to make that change happen. So let's start with question 1, the business model. So NFF defines the business model as how an organization makes and spends money in service of its mission. So essentially, we're talking about revenue and expenses and how that relates to what you do, your mission, and your impact. The business model may evolve over time, and that's one of the key stories we tell, is how that business model is changing. It's also influenced by internal and external factors like vision and strategy, like the community need that you're addressing, like funder demand and other market factors. It's affected by business drivers. So to define a business driver, say it's a measurable unit that impacts your performance. So for example, if you're a performing arts organization, a driver is number of ticket sales or the price of tickets. And a further driver for ticket sales specifically could be something like advertising. It's also affected by the stage of your organizational life cycle. So are you a startup? Are you more in the infancy phase or the adolescent phase, or a maturing organization? Being able to articulate that business model, not just to your internal team, board, and stakeholders, but to others outside of your organization, is a key component of owning your financial story. So to ground this concept in an example, I've created a fictional small education nonprofit and written a narrative to describe their business model. So we're going to start with, what do we do in service of mission? And if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read it to you. So our mission: to serve our mission of helping parents support their children's educational success. We conduct research, we offer free parent resources, and provide school-based training. So how do we pay for it? So we charge fees for our school-based trainings, which cover 100% of the direct costs as well as indirect. This earned revenue comprises 50% of our annual revenue, but for the remaining 50%, we raise unrestricted support, which is vital for our research activities and resource library. So 20% comes from 2 semi-annual appeals, 10% comes from a gala, 30% from one foundation who has served as a longtime partner, and 40% comes from a mix of 10 foundations with grants ranging between $10,000 and $50,000. So that's the revenue story in, I don't know how many words this is, but in, let's say, 60 words or less, you've told the revenue story. For the expense side of this story, it can be concisely and simply told like this. So 70% of our expenses relate to our 20 employees who conduct research, create curriculum and other resources, deliver trainings, provide management, administrative, and fundraising support. 15% relates to consultants who provide subject expertise and management of our online resource library. 10% relates to occupancy, and 5% relates to administrative expense. And then what are other fiscal needs? What are other key pieces of information that will help you understand this business model? So this speaks a bit to the capital needs of the organization. So this organization says, we budget for surpluses that are sufficient to, 1, cover debt payments on a loan we have for leasehold improvements, 2, build a technology reserve to save for future large improvements to our online platform, 3, maintain an operating reserve that holds at least 3 months of operating expenses, and 4, maintain an opportunity reserve for program experimentation and unfunded research. Our leadership and board oversees these three reserves via policies that define purpose, goals, and management. So again, in this story, in what looks like 300 words or less or so, you've basically heard the whole picture. So what does it take, revenue, expense, and capital, to manage this organization in support of mission? So let's move on to the second question of what trends can I observe? So if you attended the second webinar in our series on reading financial statements, you would have learned a lot about trend analysis. So we won't go into this in depth, but we want to leave this slide behind for you so that when you're looking at year-over-year data and want to think about trends, we can point you to the key financial information that you should be considering. So we call these the 5 chapters of finance, 3 of them coming from the income statement. First, focused on profitability and savings. Essentially, are we making a profit and is it enough? 2, revenue dynamics. So how are we making money and how is that changing over time? 3, expense dynamics. So how are we spending money and how is that changing? And then the last 2 chapters come to the balance sheet, talking about balance sheet health and liquidity. So for health of the balance sheet are the size, nature, and distribution of our assets, our liabilities, and our net assets. Are they appropriate for our organization? And then around liquidity, do we have enough cash and resources to support our organization? So in thinking about some of these indicators, we encourage you to boast the positive things, but to address the red flags. So again, we'll leave you with these slides that you can refer to following this webinar. But a couple of the indicators on the income statement that you might highlight are consistent operating surpluses, revenue that's reliable and repeatable, and surpluses that are sufficient in size to cover the full cost of your organization. Red flags would be declining operating results, year-over-year deficits, or any significant swings in revenue composition without a compelling explanation. And then second, with financial indicators for the balance sheet. Positive ones would be things like evidence that you're investing back into your fixed assets, that you're managing debt responsibility, that you have sufficient cash on hand, sufficient liquid net assets, and that your current assets exceed your current liabilities. Red flags would be any kind of steady decline of your net assets, low liquidity, or liabilities as an increasing portion of your total assets. So with that, we'll come to our last question, which is for any organization that's experiencing or planning for significant change and growth. Again, this requires some special storytelling. So the story here is around how an investment of change capital will cause your organization to change or expand in a way that your resulting business model is stronger or more adaptable, or your work is generating greater impact. One way we talk about that change process is through this graph, where we're portraying a growth situation. So to orient you to this slide, we have time along the horizontal axis and dollars along the vertical. We have expenses as the red line and our business model revenue as the green. What we typically see when an organization launches a new line of business or expands a line of business or launches a new program, there's some need for an upfront investment. Our expenses exceed our revenue for a period of time until our revenue catches up. Some of our new expenses will be one-time investments, but many will be ongoing, things like new staff salaries and maintenance of new systems. Our goal is to get here, to manage to a business model that makes more money than it needs to keep it going. So we're generating those surpluses that pay for the full cost of doing business. But first we have to figure out how we're going to get through here. How we're going to cover these business model deficits in the short term so we can generate those surpluses in the long term. And there's 2 ways we see this done. It could be paid through your own savings, using cash you already have to fund that change. But since our sector as a whole is pretty slim on savings, we usually use savings on a fairly small organic change. For large change, expensive changes, we're probably going to need some outside dollars, some special flexible money that we at NFF called change capital. So this is a rich and complex topic, so if this is relevant for your organization, I encourage you to attend webinar 12 in this series titled Planning for Growth, which will explore this subject with greater depth. So I wanted to wrap up our time by introducing a case study that you can take home with you and look at and start looking for trends and thinking about how you might tell them. Now, in this case, of course, you don't know their full situation, so you won't be able to answer it. But I do want you to look at these financial statements with the eyes of the external audience who would look at this and have some questions. So I would encourage you to read this statement of activities and answer the questions to the left. Look for revenue trends, look for expense trends, look at your operating surplus or deficit. What do you see? And after coming up with those questions, I've written a narrative that could tell this story. And in this narrative, I've highlighted the ways that they are telling the story. So first, they succinctly describe their business model in this first paragraph. In the second paragraph, they're talking about a trend, the effect, and how they responded. And in the third, they're doing the same thing. So you'll see 2 slides of that I encourage you to read after this webinar as a take-home. Same thing with the balance sheet. So look at this balance sheet with year-over-year information and ask yourself what trends you see. What questions would you have as the outside reader? And then go ahead and read how they've described these trends. Again, we're going to see them identifying an event and then talking about its effect, talking about a trend, and talking about their response. Again, same thing on this as well. So to wrap up our time, before we go to questions, I wanted to highlight the key takeaways that I'm hoping that you have taken from this webinar. First is, I hope I've convinced you that financial stories are powerful, particularly in the way that when stakeholders understand your financial story, they can make better decisions to support you. Third, I hope you take away the idea of telling your story early and often. Don't give opportunity for misinterpretation. And then finally, I want you to think about these 3 questions for your own organization. So can you define your business model? Look back at that example that I gave you from that fictional small education nonprofit. Can you write a similar story? 2, can you look at your audit and can you look at multiple years of your own financial data and identify financial trends? And then for any of you who are thinking about change and growth, have you considered how that change is affecting your business model and the resources that you need to do it? So to help you continue this way of thinking, we are going to send home with you some guiding questions for some of these common storytelling documents that we went through today, some guiding questions for writing a comprehensive financial narrative, and then 2 articles that dive into the subject a little more. The first one diving really deeply into how to think about different funding models from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and then one just more generally about telling your financial story. That one was written by me. So with that, we have 6 minutes remaining, and I'll pass it on to Dom to highlight any questions that have come up.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. So the first question we have is, I like the idea of having our audit be more accessible to staff and board, but I'm afraid it will be confusing when the presentation is so different from our internal presentation of numbers. How can I reconcile that?
Yeah, great question. So as I had highlighted when we were talking about the audit before, I encourage you to align the format of the audit and your internal statements as much as possible. So for example, something that really trips up nonprofits is this idea of how to reflect restricted funds and how they get released through the year. And your auditor goes through a very specific process to make sure that they're reflecting it correctly. And usually the nomenclature you see on the audit is something called net assets released from restriction. That is one of the key parts of your audit that you really want to make sure that you understand how that reflects your own internal documentation. And if you can't make that parallel, something is missing there. There's some kind of disconnect. So I would start there. But then there are other ways that an audit could more reflect best practices for how you're internally thinking of financing. For example, pulling out any special non-operating revenue and expenses, like those special one-time expenses that will not be ongoing in your business model. The way that you talk about board designated funds is also something you can keep consistent in your audit and your internal statements.
Great, thanks Beth, that was helpful. So we have 2 more questions in 3 more minutes before we have to close out. So the next question is, how can I talk to a funder about a deficit?
Yeah, so first I would say, tell the story to yourself. So make sure that you understand why you had a deficit. In rare cases, maybe that was planned, so maybe there's a real clear story there, but if it wasn't planned, what caused it? And that could often be something like you budgeted for revenue that wasn't secured, so you had some revenue risk throughout the year, and the revenue picture looked differently, and that you weren't able to manage expenses accordingly. If the reality is that it was poor management, that might be something you might not want to say explicitly, but you can talk about how you're making changes to how you're managing expenses going forward, and that because of a more challenging situation, now you're making your controls and your tracking of expenses even more rigorous than you had before. Again, going back to my example of highlighting events, their effects, your response, and their effect, you want to go through that same kind of process in explaining that deficit to a funder.
Great, thanks, Beth. So this last question, I think is an interesting one. So it's about the financial story, its transparency, and the question is sort of, is there a thing as being too transparent with your finances?
Yeah, I love that. So first and foremost, give information that's relevant to the party that you're giving it to. So again, I hope that how we went through the various documents where you're often asked to tell your story was helpful in thinking through that of what's really relevant. So don't give too much information just for the sake of giving information. Make it relevant. Second, I'd say to just be careful about how you talk about risk. Risk should be something that shouldn't scare your stakeholders, but it should make them feel comfortable that you've considered things that might affect your finances and responsible ways to respond to that. I think in the nonprofit sector, particularly if we have been underfunded or experienced some financial challenges, we may tend to be more conservative or more pessimistic, or maybe kind of have this poverty mindset of you're never going to get the resources that you need to really deliver how you want to. But I'd say avoid that negativity and instead think thoughtfully about the reality of your situation and how you've considered multiple scenarios. I'd also say don't give bad information without having a real plan for fixing it. So again, this idea of financial narratives should give confidence to anyone who's hearing them.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. So with that, I'd like to close us out for today. Beth, if you could go to the next slide. I'd like to let you all know that Series 3 of our 3-part webinar series kicks off next Tuesday, and this series provides tools to support strategic decision-making. The series kicks off with program economics, where we'll be discussing how to evaluate your programs and to see how they contribute to your money and mission objectives. I also like to remind you there's still time to register for the program economics webinar and the remaining webinars in our 14-part series, and there's still plenty of package offerings which offer a 15% discount off of multiple webinar sessions. So following the close of this webinar, you'll be redirected to a feedback survey unique to today's session. Please do give us your feedback on your experience, as we'd love to hear from you. Also, as a reminder, I'll be emailing you the webinar recording, slide, and the supplementary material within 24 hours after the session is complete. So finally, I'd like to thank our partners on the next slide. Beth, if you can advance. Our partners are absolutely critical to the success of the series, and we're really honored to work with each and every one of them. So with that, I hope you really enjoyed our conversation today, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. So thanks again for joining. Bye, everyone.